The Roaring Twenties started in Europe in 1918 with the end of the First World War and continued in myth and maybe even in reality until the dramatic changes came during the decade. We saw a fascist government take over in Italy in 1922 with Mussolini, dramatic reparations imposed on Germany by the winners of World War I, growing economic hardship that continued to move toward a full-blown depression, and the Nazi Party under Hitler taking over the German government in 1932. During the same time period, Paris and Berlin became centers and beacons for many people looking for answers about how could the trauma and devastation of the World War become a reality. Progressive movements of theater, art, poetry, music all tried to come to some kind of terms about what was happening. Thanks for joining us today in Facing Reality for Social Justice as we take a look at one of the more important movements to come from this very fruitful political, artistic, and philosophical adventure, Surrealism. The first Surrealist Manifesto was written in 1924 by Breton, and it has had a profound impact on how we look at the world since then. We'll be talking today to Penelope Rosemont, who has been central to the Surrealist movement since the 1960s. She was politically active during the anti-Vietnam War movement as part of Students for Democratic Society, SDS. She was instrumental and a guiding force in the small press company Charles Kerr Publishing, a well-respected publisher of political and artistic titles, including Surrealism. And her poetry and prints have graced numerous pages of Surrealism over the years. After our conversation, we'll have a bit of music as well. Over the years, many Surrealists have enjoyed and treasured the blues. So we'll go back to 1924, the year of the first Surrealist Manifesto, to listen to Maggie Jones sing Boxcar Blues and Western Union Blues. But first, our conversation with Penelope Rosemont. Oh, hi, Penny. One of the things that is of quite a bit of interest, I think, to me, and I'm sure to a lot of other people as well, is that you're part of a movement that has done something that a lot of movements haven't been able to do, which is to be around for 100 years. In 1924, the Surrealist Manifesto was written by Breton, and you also in 2024 have the 100th anniversary of that event and a celebration as well. And one of the things that I think would be good for us to try to do is if we can define the concept of surrealism by looking at its history a little bit. And I'd like to start that by going back to 1924. It was a very interesting time, a couple of years, 6 years after the end of the First World War, the great war to end all wars until they started to count them, as somebody once said. Mussolini had taken over the government in Italy as a fascist. Weimar was going strong in Germany. And there were a lot of things that were going on with ideas floating around and everything else. And part of that was the introduction of a new idea, which I'm sure had some roots going a lot back further, a new idea of surrealism. So if you could just touch on that, why do you think, well, if you can, where did that come from? What are a little bit of the background of that movement? And why do you think it really took off in a way that a lot of others haven't? I mean, you had the Dadaists, the Futurists, but Surrealism had some real staying power to it. Why do you think that was?
The Surrealists, of course, came out of the Dadaists who met in Switzerland, and they were a fairly international group. Emmy Hemmings was from Germany, Tristan Tzara from Romania. They were joined by many other people from Germany, Austria, different countries. So they started out as an international group. And Tristan Tzara apparently was a great correspondent, and he corresponded with Breton. So Dada moved to France, and there it was quite successful. People had many scandals and quite a bit of fun and produced some great poetry. But It was after the war. It was a devastating war, particularly for the young men who had been in it, which were Andre Breton, Jacques Vaucher, several of the other surrealists. And they were completely hostile to Western civilization. They thought that there was no way it really should be called civilization, in fact. So they wanted to search for something new. And basically, they heard of Freud also, and they heard of psychoanalysis. Dreams became a big thing back then because of the interpretation of dreams. And surrealists believed that if they could explore their unconscious, find the creativity, they might be able to create a different sort of future and a different daily life. Now, they were all influenced by Marxism and the things that were current at the time. And in fact, they were very inspired by the Russian Revolution, which seemed to herald great changes. They became communists for a while, basically until the communists solidified into a sect with top-down orders. And then the surrealists wouldn't abide by that because they had their own idea of what to explore and how to explore it and what their contribution would be. So Breton described surrealism as pure psychic automatism.
Right. Well, let me ask. I mean, one of the things I did, and obviously preparing for today, is to look at the first Surrealist Manifesto, and a couple of things struck me. One is that it was talking in his own way. Breton was talking about a lot of the ideas and the concepts that were going on then, but gave a different twist to it. One of the famous quotes from the manifesto: "A man proposes and disposes. The mere word of freedom is the only one that still excites me." What he twists it with, or changes it with, is that when man proposes and disposes, because a lot of people were talking about that during the 1920s, what he talks about is poetry teaches him how to do this. And when he talks about the word freedom, is that the greatest freedom is the freedom of thought. Now, that puts a different touch on, obviously, the conversation that was happening after the First World War, as things are trying to find their own direction. In the 1930s, a lot of that became extraordinarily political with what was going on, Spanish Civil War and some of the changes in Russia. But before we get into some of that kind of a discussion, could you talk about this idea of freedom and the relationship of freedom and dreams, as you mentioned, in Freud, and poetry from the early days of the 1920s, its importance for the Surrealists, as was art, obviously, but how do you see that happening in the 1920s with what people were talking about, what they were thinking about, and what they were trying to come up with?
Well, Breton had also been influenced by the anarchists. And so, of course, he thought of freedom both politically and psychically and in terms of society. So they basically wanted everyone to have just as much freedom as they possibly could without damaging the freedom of someone else. And one of the things they organized in terms of a surrealist group was a very diverse group of individuals with all kinds of opinions, but they were able to get along because they cherished other people's ideas and because they were moving toward what they were hoping was a new society, trying to search everywhere for clues and means to a new sort of way of living. So surrealism actually considers itself a way of life. In terms of social change, later in life, Breton began looking at Charles Fourier and the utopianists. But they were always political. Some of their very first actions were to oppose the racism of the colonial exhibition in Paris. They had their own counter exhibition and to celebrate other peoples of the world outside France. So they were some of the first people to think that there was much in the world that could be contributing to our civilization that would enrich it.
What, in a sense, the idea of and some of the things that you're talking about is within the context, but also is threatening or changing the context of a train of thought from the 19th century of romanticism. That's sort of the part of the thing that exists still in surrealism, but at the same time, something that is very based on the political reality or the lived reality of people in the 1920s going into the 1930s. Do you see that as central to the idea of romanticism or romantic anti-capitalism, as some people have said, that that was a concept that was part of the surrealist movement from the beginning, but also something that led through a theme that was able to keep it together over over 100 years. How do you think that that fit in?
Michael Louis has written extensively on revolutionary romanticism, which is a very good point. I don't think Breton ever put it in those words, but he definitely had that love of the natural world, the love of the old ruins, the love of the past, and the many sort of spirits of the past. They enjoyed looking at Celtic magic and various kinds of magic. They didn't think that there was any area of human knowledge that they shouldn't explore. And so while they proceeded rationally for the most times, and I like to call surrealists rational irrationalists, because they acknowledged that we were irrational, basically. But we had found reason, we had the Enlightenment, we could make choices based on reason. And so basically, it was a very interesting mix of ideas that were created there. And I think it was very fruitful ultimately because it searched everywhere.
Yeah, when you talk about the concept of revolutionary romanticism, and Lovey's where I was sort of aiming for to talk more specifically about it in a minute or two. Well, one of the things that Breton goes back to in his manifesto, the first manifesto, is the concept of logic, where he talks about the reign of logic is only for solving problems of secondary interest. But he's trying to, in the manifesto, trying to look at the world in a non-logical way, if you will. I guess that's through dreams, through the concept of inspiration from different ideas, different ways of looking at the world. But you're putting it within the context also of the Enlightenment, sort of refined by romanticism, moving into surrealism. Is that sort of the pattern that you saw developing in the 1920s?
I believe so. And of course, one thing about romanticism that we immediately think about when we think about it is love. And Breton very much upheld the idea of love. He believed that there was love between men and women, and love between people in the group, and love between any sexual relationship. Basically was okay with surrealism as long as it was based on love and basically respect. And so that was part of romanticism you were perhaps hoping for me to mention. But they also did like Anne Radcliffe and all the haunted castles and things like that. So they were very fond of these characters. There was one book by Matthew Gregory Lewis called The Monk, and it was highly romantic. It was also very anti-religious, which the surrealists loved. They also loved Latremont, who I don't know, you could call him on the edge of madness. And they celebrated madness also as a creative force and a different way of looking at our world. It wasn't discarded as something that, oh, they're just crazy. It was discussed as a different way of looking at the world.
Could you go into that a little more? Because a lot of the surrealist art shows a way of looking at the world which is understandable. You can see what people are trying to say, but obviously in a way that distorts the way we usually look at the world, or a person, or an image, or anything else. And this idea of madness that you're talking about, could you just expand on it a little bit? How does that fit within, or does it fit within the way that all the surrealists try to sort of explain their concept of the world and the way people should look at it?
Now it's become pretty commonplace in TV and movies and everything. So it's nothing that would be very surprising in a way. Back then, of course, there was Antonin Artaud, the theater and its double, but it was a way in which you would sort of create a disorientation. Breton and the early surrealists used to like to go to perhaps 5 movies at a time. They'd start out in one movie and then they'd see a little bit, and then they'd go to the next movie and then they'd see a little bit, and then they'd go to the third movie and then they'd start repeating. So they wanted to disorient their senses, try and create a new pattern out of what they were seeing, rather than accept the pattern they were given. And I think, the way we have it now, of course, a scene on TV lasts about 30 seconds, and you get to see about 50 commercials per, show. And so we're used to being extremely disoriented, but not necessarily in a good way. The surrealist experiment, though, was very interesting. They tried to do it with poetry, too, in the sense that the more diverse the image was, the greater its power. So they would try and come up with images that were striking. And Latremont was good at this, so is Breton, although Breton actually writes in quite a sensible way in many of his poems. He has wonderful images, but they're strung together rather rationally.
Right. That concept of how to look at the world, as you sort of referred to earlier, it took a political turn in the 1930s, if not earlier, with from the development. We had fascism in Italy from 1922, but when Hitler came to power in Germany in 1932, the political repression hit very hard in Germany, obviously. But there was also the Spanish Civil War, which sort of excited a lot of people in the possibilities. A lot of people on the left with the possibilities of being able to, as a way, as one person put it back then, a way to get back into Germany or get back into Italy as an opposition is to go through Spain. And some of the surrealists actually participated in the fighting in Spain in support of the Republic. And you mentioned that there was somewhat of a connection to the anarchists. For instance, somebody would go with the Durruti battalion rather than with one of the other left organizations like the Plume. Could you talk about that idea, the political idea of anarchism? Libertarian socialism is a possible explanation. I'm not quite sure where to go with this, but it was a very political time, and it pulled people in, whether you wanted to or not, in some ways. And how did the surrealists generally relate to that? And specifically, were there changes in the movement where some people went one way or another during that period?
It seems to me that most of them were with the POUM or the anarchists. Mary Lowe was in Barcelona editing a newspaper in the English language for that. And I believe Pere was fighting somewhere on the front for them. Now, E.F. Grinnell and Amparo were involved somewhat. They left and went to New York, and Grinnell, for many years after that, edited a newspaper, España Libre, out of New York for the whole time Franco was still alive. he was questionably alive. I mean, he was really out of it. But I mean, they could come together because Franco was a reactionary, fascist, Catholic, and he really
Right.
was planning on devastating many communities. So basically, they were fighting back. I don't know about any greater key that Spain could be to Italy and everywhere else, because it seemed to me they were very busy fighting in Spain and never really got out of that. In fact, many people were lucky to escape with their lives. So it was interesting, the rise of dictatorships in Europe. It's very troubling to see that it happened the way it did.
Right. And, in some ways, you see some of that reflection going on now in those sort of times. Before we get into a little bit more of the modern discussions of surrealism, one thing that sort of interested me as well, though, we had people referred to in the Surrealist Manifesto, like Knut Hamsun, and some of the other authors of the period, who weren't particularly in the Surrealist movement, but Breton was looking to them as a way of describing the world. But they also went in a very different direction politically. Some of them becoming quite strong supporters of the fascist movement. And I'm not implying anything within surrealism that went in that direction, but there was a lot of turmoil in the ideas, what was happening in the 1920s and 30s. What kept the surrealists together in a sense of moving in a certain direction towards the left, rather than moving in any kind of a direction that would support any of the authoritarian movements that were going on then?
Well, I don't think their ideas on religion, politics, women, or many other aspects of life fitted in. I mean, they also really did support some sort of workers' revolution, but they'd given up on the communists on it. So that really wouldn't have led them to cooperate with any fascists. Now, you may be thinking of Dolly when you're thinking of somebody who did cooperate, but remember, he was safely in New York. In fact, he was the first surrealist to be in the United States and make some kind of fuss there. So he was possibly trying to, keep out of trouble in terms of some little property he had back home. He didn't want it seized or some such. Why he was more friendly to Catholicism. But on the other hand, his painting of Gala on the cross can be looked at as maybe somewhat anti-religious anyway. So Dali was kind of an enigma. He liked to be that way, and he wanted to be independent. So he said all sorts of stupid things, some of which were quite good. His book, Conquest of the Irrational, was quite good. But Breton and the Surrealists did expel him because they didn't appreciate even marginal support for the Franco government.
Okay, well, that puts for me, puts a little bit of a political context on the surrealist movement, which I think is quite important to look at as well. And one of the things that after the Second World War, as we get into the 1950s and the 1960s, surrealism also, is like everything else, I'm sure, has gone through some reevaluation of its history and of how it's going to fit into things that were going on in the world. And there's, as you mentioned before, there was a very good book by Michael Ovey on surrealism. And there's something in the introduction to that by Donald Lacrosse that I'd like to just read and get your comment on it. Surrealism is not and has never been and will never be a school of literary modernism or a group of artists with a shared outlook, Lovey persuasively argues. Rather, it is better understood as an anthropological study of liberty, read through an optic of independent, revolutionary, Hegelian-Marxist dialectics, barbed with strikingly original libertarian impulses. Now, there's a lot of words in there. It looked to me to be an important sentence when I first read it, but I wasn't quite sure what it meant. One of the things I can get out of it, though, is that what Lacrosse seems to be saying is that it was never a school of literary modernism or a group of artists with a shared outlook. And I was wondering if you agree with that, or and this is, I think, within the context of the 1960s with the death of Breton, with the questioning within the movement of which way to go. And how do you read this? Would you say there's never been a school of literary modernism or a group of artists with a shared outlook? I guess primarily that's what I'm asking.
That's correct. They don't really have a shared outlook. And they're not really consider themselves a school. They never tried to establish themselves as that. Of course, there's the School of Sociology in Paris, who met in a cafe much like the Surrealists for many years, and then were recognized and became academics and became, well, anyway, they succeeded being a school, whether they liked it or not. But yeah, I love that statement of Lacosse's. And I had long expressed that the Chicago Surrealist group was a bunch of anthropology students run amok, because we all had met in St. Clair Drake's anthropology class, basically. And they created the Anti-Poetry Club at Roosevelt, which essentially morphed into the Chicago Surrealist Group and Solidarity Bookshop. So that went that way. Now, in terms of Paris, now we went there in 1966 and we spent 6 months and we met with the group. They seemed to have a variety of positions. I would say some were socialists, not very many leaned toward communism. Others were more interested in anarchism, and some were sort of Spanish militants still because Franco was in power. So there was an interesting group there. There were some people from communist countries like Czechoslovakia who'd seen it in action there, and it was pretty repressive. That's why they were living in Paris. So it was difficult. They all had different experiences, but talked about it and tolerated each other. Now, when we came, of course, it was sort of on the edge of many things. For one thing, Paris was full of strikes. One day we'd go out and the metro would be on strike. And so, okay, we take a bus. The next day we go to the bus stop and the buses were on strike. Okay, so we took the metro. So then the third day, the electricity would be off. Like, okay, this is an unusual place to live. So we know that the workers were fairly militant at that time. They apparently thought that it was a time of prosperity. Mind you, this was just 20 years after the end of World War II. That didn't add up in my head then, because back then, if you're 21, 20 years is a long time. By the time you get to 80, you realize, oh my God, only 20 years. So anyway, they were thinking that they should have a better deal. And the Surrealists were pretty sympathetic to this, so there were no complaints there. And we were sympathetic to the Black uprisings in Chicago and the organizations, the civil rights organizations and the political things. We had been studying all sorts of radical movements. The IWW had newspapers from all over the world, so we kind of knew what was going on. We had our bookshop, people came in and talked to us about things. So before we left, we wrote a little bit of a manifesto saying solidarity with the African American struggle. We want the working class to take control of whatever they can and get a better, it was sort of a typical New Left manifesto. We did add a few surrealist things, and they liked it. So they printed it in the second issue of L'Archebras, but it was translated into French and they read it. Now, the second issue was already 1969. In 1968, just, in May, things broke out in Paris. There was Sorbonne barricades. There were the situationist ideas floating about, workers' control. It was very sympathetic. The students really wanted to make a social change. They really, really wanted to see a change. And of course, we sympathized with them perfectly. The Surrealists put out several quite incendiary leaflets at the time. And there were charges against them, which were ultimately dropped, which is nice because otherwise they probably would have been in prison. But this led to a split in the group afterward. Partly it was splitting anyway because after Breton's death, their factionalism arose to an extent. Breton had a way of keeping the peace. He really knew how to keep a group together. And after he was gone, several newspapers came out from different people in the group. They were all good. It would have been wise if they had stuck together, but everyone had something they wanted to say, and so being literate and writers, they all wrote it up and published their own newspapers. So this led to problems. Ultimately, Schuster decided that Surrealism was over and that there would be an eternal Surrealism, but not a group. And he went ahead and collected a lot of documents, historical documents, and got great introductions to them. And Jose Pierre, they did an enormous amount of wonderful work collecting material, but they weren't active. Now, Vincent Benur gathered a group around himself and his wife, and they continued the activity with a relatively small newsletter. But it was quite important, and it did keep people together, and the group grew, and it has stayed together, published several different magazines. They've never quite lasted as long as some of Breton's magazines, but even there, he went through quite a few magazines in his time. So anyway, they began publishing their books and making contributions. They've been having exhibitions that have been wonderful. Prague has been come out from underneath the repressive forces there. They've had exhibitions there. Saint-Cirque-le-Popie, where Breton lived for summers, has had exhibitions there. So the French have remained active. The English groups have become more active, but more scattered. It has survived.
Well, it survived dramatically also in the anniversary meeting of this year, 2024. And without going into the details of it, just for a couple of minutes, could you go through where you see it going now? Do you see it as flourishing like in the 1920s, or sort of trying to pull itself together in a different kind of a way, a different kind of direction? How do you feel about it now, Penny?
There is a problem in that, first of all, we had a couple of plague years, which really kind of ruined many smaller businesses. That has been a problem because in Chicago, some of us started a little gallery, and the gallery did manage to survive for a year, but it was very, very hard because people came out, wore their masks to the openings, but very few people really came out. I mean, everyone was hiding in their homes. And many small bookstores and cafes have closed also. I'm hoping new ones will open up. But at the same time, they say that people have gotten used to using the new technology, which is good and bad. because basically it's a communication for the elite. You got to have a computer or a cell phone. You got to know how to work them. And so it's a different sort of communication. I don't really know that it'll remain the same. It may spread more because there are many surrealist websites on the internet, some more surrealist than others. But many of them are pretty sincere in their opposition to the powers that be and their idea that they're going to build another sort of world, that we can exercise our imaginations and go on with things and try and make changes. So I do believe that it's very strange. We're going to have a worldwide movement. I was recently interviewed by 2 Korean students, and I was very pleased to do an interview with them. Now, as far as I know, there haven't been surrealists in Korea. There were surrealists for a long time in Japan, but this may be an international blooming of things. On the other hand, Facebook and so many other things are so subject to being able to censor you if they wish, that perhaps that will kind of change things. I don't really know. I hope for the future, and I see the ideas are getting out there. But whether we'll have to have anything like a group that can cooperate, be productive, and last a long time, that's hard to say.
Well, the group has already lasted quite a few years and done very well. I think changing the way that everyone looks at the world. I mean, that's exceptional. And the reaction of people to surrealism has to be that, it's played already a very important role in people's concept of dreams, the concept of art, and the concept of really of politics and the way people look at each day that they lead their lives. But on that note, you're becoming a very international movement. You have always been one, and I think the meeting in France has shown that continues. And you are a very vibrant movement. I'm sure that the music and some of the videos that came out of the meeting showed that as well. There's the music and the art and everything else that goes with it. But finally, I'd just like to thank you for the time that you gave us today and for an explanation of taking it from 1924 to 2024 and with everything that goes with that. And I really do thank you for that very much.
Gonna meet him, ain't got time to stay.
That was Maggie Jones singing Boxcar Blues, written in 1924 by Spencer Williams. The flip side of the disc in those days was Western Union Blues, and with the tip of our hat to Paul Guerin for his work on the blues over his lifetime, here's Maggie Jones again. Well, that's our show for today. If you liked it, tell your friends. It's always good to share things. Anyway, thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Heimbach.